Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Ray Dalio's massive 500-year study of history to understand the exact mechanics behind the rise and fall of global empires. If you've ever felt like the world is going through these unprecedented, chaotic changes right now, you're definitely not alone. But what if I told you that these events aren't actually unprecedented at all? What if they're just part of a timeless, universal cycle that has happened over and over again? Well, that is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
To figure out where we're going, we first need to look at what happened in the past. And we're starting with a visceral moment of panic in 1971, when the United States literally ran out of real money. Back then, paper money was essentially just a check in a checkbook. It had absolutely no value on its own unless it could be exchanged for gold, which was the actual money. But the US was spending a lot more money than it was earning. Imagine writing checks knowing full well you don't have the cash in the bank to clear them. In 1971, that's exactly what the United States was doing on a global scale.
So President Nixon was forced to go on national television and completely break the dollar's link to gold to prevent a massive default. Everyone expected total chaos. Ray Dalio himself was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting an absolute collapse. But guess what? The market surged nearly 25%. Why? Because breaking the link to gold meant the government could just keep spending simply by printing more paper dollars. And printing paper money devalues the currency, which automatically inflates asset prices, pushing up the value of stocks, gold, and commodities.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, the 1971 money shock. Second, the big cycle explained. Third, Phase 1, the rise. Fourth, Phase 2, the top. Fifth, Phase 3, the decline. And finally, number 6, the future of our order.
Let's start with Section 1, the 1971 money shock and the symptoms of a changing order.
The crucial point here is that a reserve currency is the absolute linchpin of global power. When an empire becomes the dominant international trading power, its transactions are paid in its own currency. That makes it the preferred global medium of exchange and the preferred store of wealth. People all over the world save in it. Once an empire's money is the global standard, they gain what's called an exorbitant privilege. It's essentially the ultimate superpower cheat code. They can borrow far beyond their means from all over the world, and if they run out of their own money, they can simply print more.
Moving on to Section 2, the big cycle explained, looking back over 500 years of history.
The reality is, world orders just aren't permanent. They play out in overlapping cycles of about 250 years, separated by these turbulent 10 to 20-year transition periods of great conflict. The baton of global power clearly passes over time. First, the Dutch Empire and the guilder peaked around the 1600s. As they declined, the British Empire and the pound took over, peaking in the 1800s. Then came the United States and the dollar, establishing the current world order after World War II. And today, we're seeing the clear and rapid rise of the Chinese Empire.
So how do we actually know where an empire sits on this timeline? Well, just like checking a patient's health, we can track 8 vital signs to precisely measure whether a world power is rising, at its peak, or actively declining into sickness. By averaging these measurable metrics, everything from education and military strength to the power of their financial centers, we can see not just a narrative, but a hard, data-driven picture of a nation's total power on the global stage.
Let's dive into Section 3. Phase 1, the rise, and how this engine of growth is built.
During the rise, there is a pure mechanical cause and effect happening. It always starts with education. If a nation invests heavily in education, and we mean character and work ethic, not just skills, then it drives incredible innovation. That innovation makes their workers highly productive and incredibly competitive in world markets. As their share of global trade explodes, they have to build a strong military to protect their trade routes. And ultimately, this massive economic footprint crowns their money as the global reserve currency.
A perfect historical example of this, the Dutch. They combined unparalleled inventiveness in shipbuilding with the revolutionary creation of capitalism itself to finance their massive wealth. They didn't just invent amazing ships that could travel the world to collect riches, they literally invented the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the very first stock market to fund those voyages. They created a virtuous cycle of wealth generation that absolutely changed the world forever. But of course, nothing lasts forever. That brings us to Section 4, Phase 2, the top and the seeds of decline. Prolonged peace and prosperity inevitably breed complacency. In fact, embedded within the very fruits of an empire's success are the seeds of its decline. You see, as people in a rich country earn more, they become more expensive and less competitive than workers in rising nations. They start betting on the good times continuing and borrow heavily. As the financial bubble grows, the wealth gap naturally widens. This predictably leads to intense political polarization, where populists clash over a shrinking economic pie. The left wing generally seeks to redistribute wealth to the poor and marginalized, while the right wing seeks to defend capital and maintain wealth in the hands of those who generated it. The environment becomes deeply, deeply polarized.
And while the empire is fighting itself at home, it's also spending far beyond its means abroad. To maintain dominance, the empire drastically overextends itself. This is perfectly illustrated by the staggering $8 trillion the U.S. has spent on post-9/11 foreign wars, all while increasingly borrowing from its own rival nations. Just imagine trying to fund an $8 trillion war by borrowing from your biggest geopolitical rivals. That is the exorbitant privilege at work. But eventually, the sheer cost of maintaining the empire becomes wildly unprofitable.
Which brings us to Section 5, Phase 3, the decline, also known as the death spiral.
When the debt burdens become totally unsustainable, the facade of strength crumbles. And this death spiral is entirely mechanical. First, the debt bubble bursts. Then, the central bank is forced to print massive amounts of new money to cover the debt, which drastically devalues the currency. As living standards decline and inflation spikes, violent internal revolutions or external wars frequently break out. The empire becomes fundamentally weak and highly vulnerable to rising external rivals who look at the domestic chaos and decide it's the perfect time to mount a challenge. It happened to the Dutch, it happened to the British, and it is a very well-known pattern of decline.
Now, if you think your paper money is permanently safe, consider this rather surprising fact. Of the roughly 750 currencies that have existed since 1700, less than 20% still exist today, and absolutely all of them have been devalued. When those holding the reserve currency in the debt of the declining empire lose faith and decide to sell, that officially marks the end of the big cycle. A new world order is formed by the winners of the resulting conflicts, and the cycle begins all over again.
So where are we heading today? Section 6, the future of our order, and the question of whether this cycle can actually be broken.
Reversing a decline is incredibly difficult because it requires undoing decades of complacency and overextension. But Dalio makes a great point. A nation's greatest war is always with itself. To survive, we simply must improve our vital signs by returning to grounded, actionable realities. We have to earn more money than we spend, and we have to treat each other well. All the other metrics we talked about, education, inventiveness, military strength, they're ultimately just pathways to achieving those two simple, fundamental goals. We have to get our financial house in order and stop the internal tearing apart of our society.
So I'll leave you with this ultimate question to think about. Will we make the hard, disciplined decisions needed to sustain our success, or are we destined to repeat this 500-year cycle of collapse? I highly encourage you to keep tracking these vital signs so you're never caught by surprise, because understanding the patterns of the past is absolutely the best way to navigate the uncertain times of the future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.